All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking a look at something pretty fascinating. It's called the Cardano Blockchain Ecosystem Constitution.
Oh, this is a good one.
You shared this detailed document from GitHub, and we thought it'd be interesting to try to kind of get to the core of it
Yeah.
and see how this blockchain is thinking about governing itself.
Yeah.
It's almost like trying to understand the operating system for this decentralized world.
Yeah, exactly. This isn't just like a technical document or a how-to manual. It's
Right.
it's really a living document. It lays out the kind of the foundational beliefs, the roles that people in the Cardano community play. It talks about how they make decisions and even specific technical boundaries, It's
Yeah.
really ambitious. It's like
Yeah.
they're trying to create this self-governing blockchain ecosystem that's kind of going beyond those traditional nation-state models or
Right.
company structures.
Yeah. And for you, the learner, this deep dive is going to be a great way to kind of get up to speed really quickly on how a major blockchain project is thinking about managing its future.
Mm-hmm.
How they're going to be making important choices and ultimately making sure that this thing stays healthy for the long term.
Yeah.
And we'll be highlighting some really interesting things as we go, like
Yeah.
the formal roles and responsibilities that different community members have.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even more surprisingly, the detailed rules that even technical changes have to follow.
Yeah. I think when people first see how much detail there is, it's surprising. Like there's a lot here.
Yeah, it is. And it's well organized.
Yeah.
So we'll try to walk through it in a way that makes sense. I
Yeah.
think we should probably start by kind of setting the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll look at these core guiding principles, these technical guardrails, sort of the boundaries for how Cardano is supposed to operate.
Yeah.
Then we'll talk about who's actually part of the Cardano community.
Mm-hmm.
What are their rights? What are their responsibilities?
Yeah, exactly.
And then we'll get into the details of how the decentralized governance really works.
Right.
We'll talk about delegated representatives or DREPs, the stake pool operators or SPOs, and this constitutional committee.
Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces, but they all fit together in a really interesting way.
They do.
Yeah.
And we'll even look at how they handle money. They have this on-chain budget
Mm-hmm.
and a very careful process for spending it, and then ultimately even for changing the Constitution itself
Right.
or the technical parts of the blockchain.
Yeah, it's really well thought out. They've considered a lot of potential problems.
Yeah.
And tried to set up a framework that's really robust.
All right. So let's dive right into it. Article lays out the Cardano blockchain tenets and guardrails.
Okay.
So right off the bat, they give you 10 key tenets.
Right.
They're not ranked in order of importance or anything like that.
Mhm.
But kind of together, they create this ethical framework for the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. What's really interesting about these tenets is
Yeah.
they cover a lot of ground. You've got
Uh-huh.
tenet 1, which is all about making sure that transactions happen quickly and freely.
Right.
And that nobody can censor them, which is, that's the whole point of a decentralized system.
Right. Absolutely.
And then you've got tenet 2, which focuses on making sure that transaction costs are predictable, which is so important for getting people to actually use the blockchain
Yeah.
and for the overall health of the ecosystem.
Right. People don't know what it's going to cost. They're not going to use it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it goes beyond just kind of the basics of moving money around.
Right.
There's even tenets that focus on not getting in the way of application development.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then rewarding people fairly for their contributions to the community,
Mhm.
protecting user data, making sure that people's assets are safe.
Yeah. Yeah. They're trying to create an environment where developers can build interesting things and where
Right.
users feel safe. They're not going to have their data stolen or
Right.
have their money taken away from them.
Yeah. And it even gets into how the Cardano blockchain should interact with other systems.
Yeah.
The whole idea of interoperability, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even how to make sure that data on the blockchain is preserved for the long term.
Yeah, exactly. They're really thinking about the big picture here.
And I thought this was an interesting one.
Yeah.
Tenet 10, which is all about setting a hard cap
Right.
on the total supply of ADA. So there can only ever be 45 billion ADA
Mm-hmm.
in existence.
Right.
That's different from a lot of other cryptocurrencies that have these inflationary models.
Yeah, that's a deliberate choice.
Yeah.
They're signaling that scarcity is important
Mm,
and that it's going to play a role in how value is stored
yeah.
and how the network continues to develop over time.
Right. So these tenets really serve as kind of the guiding lights for everyone in the community.
Yeah.
And especially for the groups that are making decisions.
Right.
So whenever they're considering any kind of action, these are the principles that they're supposed to keep in mind.
Exactly. It's like, their North Star. It's what they're always supposed to be aiming for.
Right, yeah.
But it's not just about these high-level principles.
Right.
They also get much more specific. So, in the appendix, they lay out these, what they call guardrails.
Okay.
These are more concrete rules and limits for the Cardano blockchain.
Okay.
And this is where it gets even more interesting. Some of these guardrails can actually be programmed directly into the blockchain itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
So these guardrails are they're really tangible safeguards, right?
Exactly. They define the boundaries of how the blockchain is allowed to operate.
Okay.
And the fact that they can be programmed in, that's huge. It adds this extra layer of protection.
So they have this layered approach. They have the high-level tenets. Then they have these guardrails in the document.
Right.
And then some of those guardrails, the really important ones, they actually put right into the code itself.
Yeah, and that's smart, because if there's ever a conflict between, what's written down and what's actually in the code, the code wins.
Right.
Always.
So that just really emphasizes how seriously they take these rules.
Yeah, exactly. They want to make sure that the blockchain is always operating within these defined boundaries.
Right. Okay, so let's move on to Article 2.
Okay.
Which is all about the Cardano blockchain community itself.
Right.
And one of the first things that struck me about this section is how broadly they define who's actually part of this community.
Yeah. It's really inclusive. It's not like you have to, sign up or pay a fee or anything like that.
Right.
If you hold a DA, if you're developing on the blockchain, if you're building tools, if you're providing services, if you're just using it, or even just supporting it in some way,
okay,
you're considered part of the community.
So that means I'm part of the community.
You got it.
I've got a little bit of, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. So it's really open. It's decentralized.
Right.
But, with rights come responsibilities, right?
Absolutely. So if you're holding ADA, you have the right to participate in on-chain decision-making. You can vote on governance proposals and all that.
Okay.
But at the same time, the community as a whole has a responsibility to make sure that the Constitution is upheld, that the blockchain keeps running smoothly, that everyone's engaged in governance, and that any disputes are resolved fairly and transparently.
So it's not just a free ride.
Yeah.
You got to participate.
Yeah.
You got to be responsible.
Exactly. They're trying to create this sense of shared ownership.
Right.
So everyone has a stake in making sure that this ecosystem thrives.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's get into the details of how this governance really works.
Okay.
Article 3 talks about participatory and decentralized governance.
Right.
It's a pretty sophisticated system.
Yeah, it is.
It's got multiple layers, different components.
Absolutely.
But they're really focused on making sure that everything's transparent and that they're using smart contracts and all the cool tools of blockchain to make sure that decisions are made collectively.
And one of the key aspects of all this is making sure there's consensus. Different proposals need different levels of agreement, and those thresholds are spelled out in the guardrails.
Right.
Yeah.
So they've really tried to think about this carefully.
Yeah. They don't want any surprises, They want to make sure everyone understands the rules of the game from the start.
Absolutely. So at the heart of this governance system are three main groups that are responsible for voting. And they're designed to kind of keep each other in check.
Right. Yeah.
So you've got these delegated representatives, or DREPs.
Yeah.
And they're basically like elected representatives, but for ADA holders.
Exactly. If you hold ADA, you can choose to delegate your voting power to a DREP.
Okay.
And they basically vote on your behalf.
Okay. Then you've got the stake pool operators.
Right. The SPOs.
Or SPOs, and they're the ones that are responsible for kind of the nuts and bolts, right?
Yeah.
Making sure the network is running, it's secure.
Exactly. They're the ones keeping the lights on, so to speak.
Right. And then you've got this constitutional committee, which sounds pretty serious.
It is. They're the guardians of the Constitution, and they make sure that everything that happens on the blockchain aligns with the rules that are laid out in that document.
So they're kind of like the judges.
Exactly. They're the ones that interpret the law.
Right. So every ADA holder has some way to participate in these decisions.
Yes.
Whether they vote directly or they choose a DREP.
Right.
So it's got this direct democracy element to it.
It does. Every ADA owner has the right to vote
Right.
and even to propose changes to the governance structure.
Okay.
But there are also those guardrails in place to make
Yeah.
sure that things don't go off the rails.
Right. And then they have this interesting concept of an info action.
Yeah, this is pretty
So
cool.
it's like a way for the community to float an idea
Mm-hmm.
and see what people think before actually making a change.
Exactly. It's like a trial balloon.
Right.
You could put forward a potential change, get feedback from the community, and, see if it has legs before actually implementing it.
And they use this specifically for talking about budgets.
Yeah, yeah.
And how to use the treasury.
Right. So, before they actually spend any money, they
Yeah.
want to make sure that the community has had a chance to weigh in.
That makes a lot of sense.
Mm.
So they can't just kind of go rogue and start spending money on things?
Yeah. No. Everything has to be transparent.
Okay.
And there has to be this community buy-in.
And to make sure that everything's clear,
Mm-hmm.
anytime someone proposes a change,
Yeah.
it has to follow a very specific format.
Yeah. They're really big on transparency and accountability here.
Okay.
So every proposal needs to include a URL,
Right.
a cryptographic hash of any supporting documentation,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's a way to make sure that everything can be verified
Yeah.
and that there's no funny business going on.
Yeah, so people can't tamper with the proposal after
Exactly.
it's been made.
And, it also has to include a really clear explanation of why this change is being proposed,
Okay.
what problem it's trying to solve, what the benefits are.
So it's not just enough to say, hey, we want to change this parameter.
Right.
You have to explain why.
Yeah, you got to make the case for it.
Okay. Article 4 then gets into the money stuff.
Okay.
So the Cardano blockchain ecosystem budget,
Right.
it's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
How a decentralized project like this actually handles funding.
Yeah, they've got a pretty interesting system.
Yeah. So anyone in the community
Mm-hmm.
can propose a budget.
Yeah, that's one of the core principles here.
Right. And then the community votes on it
Yeah.
using those info actions
They say
that we
hi.
talked about.
Right.
And these budgets usually cover at least a year.
Yeah, that's the typical time frame.
Okay.
But they can be shorter or longer depending on the specific needs.
Okay. So it's really a community-driven approach
Yeah.
to deciding how the project is funded.
Yeah. It's not some central authority dictating how the money's going to be spent.
Right. But how do they make sure that all this money
Mm-hmm.
is managed responsibly?
Well, transparency and accountability are super important here.
Okay.
So they use smart contracts wherever possible to manage the budgets.
Okay.
And they clearly identify who's responsible for overseeing the funds.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a clear chain of command.
Right. And there are rules for actually withdrawing money from the treasury.
Oh, yeah, they're really strict about that.
Okay.
So any withdrawal has to be aligned with a previously approved budget.
Mm-hmm.
And they also have this net change limit to
So
make sure that the treasury doesn't get depleted too quickly.
they can't just drain the treasury all at once?
No. They've got to be responsible.
And the Constitutional Committee,
Mm-hmm.
they have a role in making sure that everything's kind of above board.
Yeah. They've got to make sure that any withdrawal is actually constitutional.
Right. And if someone wants to use treasury funds,
Yeah.
they have to set aside some of that money
Mm-hmm.
for independent audits.
Right. And they also have to put in place metrics
Okay.
so that people can track how the funds are being used.
So it's not just like a black box where the money disappears.
No. Everything has to be trackable
Wow.
and auditable.
All right. Let's talk about Article V, which is all about the delegated representatives or DREPs.
Right.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this was a form of liquid democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're an ADA holder,
Mm-hmm.
you have two main options for participating in governance.
Okay.
You can either register yourself as a DREP
Okay.
and vote directly on proposals,
Right.
or you can delegate your voting power to another DREP
Boom.
who you think is going to represent your interests.
Okay. So it's like choosing a representative
Mm-hmm.
to vote on your behalf.
Exactly.
Okay. And the liquid part means you can change your mind anytime.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like a traditional election where you're stuck with your representative for
Let's say-
a fixed
Right.
term.
So you can kind of keep them on their toes a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're not happy with how your DREP is voting,
Yeah.
you can just switch to someone else.
Okay. In DREPs, these can be individuals, but they could also be groups.
Yeah. They can be individuals. They can be organizations, really. Anyone who meets the requirements
Right.
and is willing to take on that responsibility.
Okay. And then they have certain thresholds that they have to meet
Right.
for their votes to actually count.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, what's to stop these dreeps from just, going rogue and doing whatever they want?
Well, they've got these codes of conduct that they're supposed to follow.
Okay.
And these codes lay out the ethical guidelines, the principles that are supposed to guide their actions.
So it's not just about the rules. It's about kind of the spirit of the rules as well.
Right, yeah. They want to make sure that drips are acting in the best interests of the community.
Okay. And these codes of conduct, they're public.
Yeah. Everyone can see them.
So if you're thinking about delegating your stake to someone, you can check out their code of conduct and see what they stand for.
Exactly. And there are also tools that the community's developing to help you evaluate different DDRIPs.
Okay, so you can see their voting record, you can see their code of conduct, and then make a decision about who you trust.
Yeah, exactly.
And these DDRIPs, they can get paid for this, right?
Yeah. They can be compensated for their time and effort.
Okay.
But any compensation arrangement has to be fully disclosed.
So there's no, under-the-table deals?
No. Everything has to be out in the open.
Okay. And they can't just kind of pay people to delegate to them or to vote a certain way?
Exactly. That would be, bribery, and that's a big no-no.
Okay. Article 6 then talks about the stake pool operators, or SPOs.
Right.
And they have a very different role from the DRIPs.
Yeah, they do. They're more focused on the technical side of things.
Okay.
Making sure the network's running smoothly, it's secure and all that.
So they're really important for the overall health of the blockchain.
Absolutely. And they also have a specific role in governance.
Okay, so they get to vote on certain things.
Right, but they vote separately from the DRIPs.
Okay.
And their input is especially important when it comes to things like hard forks. Those major upgrades to the protocol.
Right. So they're kind of like the guardians of the network.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And they also act as a check on the power of the Constitutional Committee, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In certain circumstances.
Right, in very specific situations.
Okay.
They can actually vote on things like motions of no confidence.
So if the community feels like the Constitutional Committee is not doing its job, they can try to remove them.
Right, and the SPOs have a say in that.
Okay. And the SPOs also vote on any changes to the structure of the Constitutional Committee itself.
Exactly. So things like how many members are on the committee, how long their terms are, what the voting thresholds are, all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they also vote on any security critical changes to the protocol.
Right. Yeah. Anything that could potentially affect the security of the blockchain.
Okay. So it's a pretty weighty responsibility.
It is. These SPOs, they're really entrusted with a lot of power.
Right. And they have to follow codes of conduct as well.
Yeah, just like the DREPs.
Okay. And if someone's both an SPO and a DREP, they have to disclose that, right?
Yeah, they have to be transparent about all their roles,
Yeah.
so there's no conflict of interest.
Okay. So Article 7 gets into this Constitutional Committee.
Right.
And this is kind of the big one, right?
Yeah, they're the ones who are ultimately responsible for making sure that Cardano stays true to its core principles.
Okay. So before anything actually happens on the blockchain, they have to sign off on it.
Right. They got to make sure it's constitutional.
And the people on this committee, I imagine they have to be pretty knowledgeable.
Oh, yeah. They're supposed to be experts in the Cardano ecosystem. They need to have a deep understanding of how it all works.
And they're chosen by the community, right?
Yeah, through the governance process.
Okay. And how big is this committee? How long do they serve?
Well, that's actually determined by the ADA holders.
Okay.
But there are minimum and maximal limits that are set in the guardrails.
So there's some flexibility, but it's not completely open-ended.
Right. And their terms are staggered.
Okay.
So that there's some continuity over time.
So it's not like everybody gets replaced all at once.
Exactly. They want to make sure there's always some institutional memory.
Right. And they basically have veto power over anything that's proposed?
Yeah, you could call it a constitutional veto.
Okay. So if they don't like something, they could block it.
Right. But they can't block everything.
Right.
They can't stop people from having discussions or from submitting info actions.
Okay. And they also can't block anything that relates to their own structure.
Right. So if the community wants to change how many members are on the committee or how they're chosen, the Constitutional Committee can't stop that.
Okay. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
So they're powerful, but they're not all powerful.
Right.
And if they do block something, They have to explain why.
Exactly. They can't just say, no, we don't like it.
Right.
They have to give specific reasons, and they have to reference the Constitution or the guardrails to back up their decision.
So they can't just make stuff up.
No, no, no. They've got to be able to justify their actions.
Okay. And how do we make sure that the Constitutional Committee is actually doing its job?
Well, there's this mechanism called a motion of no confidence.
Okay.
So if enough people in the community feel like the committee is not doing its job properly, they can try to trigger a vote of no confidence.
Okay.
And if that vote passes, the existing committee members have to either be reinstated or replaced before any other governance actions can happen.
So they can be fired, basically.
Yeah, essentially.
Wow. And individual members can also be removed.
Right, if there's enough evidence that they're not fulfilling their responsibilities.
Okay. And they have their own code of conduct, too.
Yeah, just like everyone else.
Okay.
They're expected to act ethically and in the best interests of the community.
And they can get paid, too.
Yes, but their compensation has to be approved by the ADA holders.
So the community has control over how much they get paid.
Exactly.
And they have to disclose if they're also serving as a DREP or an SPO.
Right. Transparency is key.
Okay. Okay. Article 8 then talks about how to change the Constitution itself.
Okay.
So the amendment process.
Right.
And, for a document like this, that's supposed to guide the project for the long term.
Right.
It's got to be able to adapt.
Yeah, exactly. It's a living document.
Right.
It's not set in stone.
So how do they actually make changes?
Well, any changes to the Constitution, including the guardrails, require a pretty high level of support.
Okay.
They need at least 65% of the active voting stake.
Wow.
Of all ADA holders.
So it's not easy to change the Constitution.
No, it's not.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah. They want to make sure there's a broad consensus before they make any major changes.
Okay.
Okay.
And the guardrails could actually have different thresholds for changing individual rules.
Right. So some rules might be easier to change than others.
Okay. Okay.
Depending on how critical they are.
All right. So now we get to the appendices.
Okay.
And Appendix I is all about the Cardano blockchain guardrails.
Right.
And this is where it gets really detailed.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah. They got all these specific rules and guidelines
Right.
that govern how things actually work on the blockchain.
Yeah, and they cover everything from the technical settings to how money is withdrawn from,